Before William Bonin became known as the Freeway Killer, he was a child. But not one raised in safety, or nurtured by love. His world, from the very beginning, was cold, violent, and disturbingly detached. The patterns that would later define him as a serial predator were seeded long before his first victim, and long before anyone even thought to intervene. William George Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in the small town of Willimantic, Connecticut. He was the middle child of 3 sons born to Robert and Alice Bonin, 2 people who, by all accounts, should never have been raising children. His father was a World War II veteran whose inner demons followed him home from the battlefield and never let go. What might have started as PTSD quickly bled into rage, alcoholism, and violent outbursts. Bonin's mother, Alice, offered no refuge. She was domineering and emotionally unstable, known more for her absence than her nurturing. The Bonin household was filled with fear. Both parents were alcoholics. William's father was a compulsive gambler who eventually lost the family home over a card game. His mother, overwhelmed or indifferent, or perhaps both, frequented bingo parlors while leaving her sons unattended. The young Bonin boys learned early that they couldn't rely on the adults around them, and William, in particular, began showing signs that something was very wrong. As a child, William was baptized and raised in the Catholic faith. He and his brothers attended St. Mary's Catholic School, but religion did little to tame what was already brewing inside him. He was aggressive toward classmates and frequently truant. His behavior escalated to the point that he was briefly placed in juvenile detention after recklessly crashing his bike into a group of young girls. Whatever that stint was meant to correct, it didn't work. When he came back, he was angrier, more rebellious, and even less cooperative with his parents. In 1953, when Bonin was just 6 years old, he and his older brother were sent away to the Franco-American school in Lowell, Massachusetts, a strict Catholic convent run by nuns. If there was ever hope that structure and discipline would help him, it ended here. The environment was not just harsh, it was brutal. Corporal punishment was commonplace. Bonin would later recall being forced to punch a fence as punishment for misbehavior. The pain wasn't just physical, it left mental scars too. And it was at this convent where things took a darker turn. At around the age of 8, Bonin was sexually assaulted by an older boy. According to his own chilling account, Bonin had asked the boy to tie his hands behind his back during the assault, claiming it made him feel more secure and less frightened. The trauma of this experience would have long-lasting effects, shaping his twisted perception of control, dominance, and sexuality. During his entire time at the convent, neither parent ever visited him or his brother. As time passed, Bonin reportedly became convinced they had died. That level of abandonment during critical developmental years is hard to overstate. He wasn't just physically isolated, he was emotionally discarded. By 1955, Bonin was returned to his family, who now lived in a home owned by his maternal grandfather. But if he hoped for any kind of stability, he wouldn't find it there either. Bonin attended Annie Vinton Elementary School with his younger brother Paul and was quickly marked as a social outcast. He was mocked by classmates with the nickname Bugsy Bonin. Already battling shame over his emerging sexual feelings, many directed toward younger boys and even male teachers, he began to further isolate himself. His behavior at school grew more combative, and he started clashing with peers regularly. Meanwhile, inside the home, the neglect deepened. Neighbors noticed that Bonin and his siblings were often hungry, dirty, and left unsupervised. One concerned woman took it upon herself to provide the boys with meals and clean clothing, realizing no one else would. Their mother had effectively checked out, often leaving the children with their grandfather, a man who, according to Alice, had molested her as a child. She later suspected that her father had done the same to her sons. The abuse didn't stop there. When left in the care of their older brother Robert Jr., who had borne the brunt of their father's physical violence. William and Paul were beaten and ridiculed. The household had no boundaries, no stability, and no protection. In that environment, Bonin began pushing limits wherever he could. He started with theft, hubcaps, license plates, small things. But soon it escalated. In 1957, he was caught and sent to a juvenile detention center. It should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it became yet another place where Bonin was victimized. While incarcerated, he was reportedly molested by an adult counselor. That abuse became a new layer of trauma, and when he returned home, his behavior darkened even further. Now a teenager, Bonin began sexually abusing his younger brother Paul. The abuse continued for 6 months until Paul finally told their mother. Rather than seeking help or involving authorities, she simply forced William to sleep in a separate bedroom. That was the end of it. No intervention. No counseling. No protection for either of them. Bonin would later admit to molesting several young boys during this time, and even exposing himself to a 10-year-old girl. These were not isolated incidents. They were early patterns, clear red flags that something was deeply wrong. And yet, nothing was done. By his early teens, William Bonin had already experienced a lifetime of trauma. He had been abandoned, assaulted, ignored, and emotionally hollowed out. His early environment wasn't just dysfunctional, it was dangerous. And it shaped him into someone who equated violence with power and control. Looking back now, it's tempting to ask the obvious question: could someone, anyone, have stopped what was coming? But the reality is, all the warning signs were there. And the system, family, school, law enforcement, missed every single one. In the next episode, we'll move into the years where the damage became irreversible. When the boy who had once been failed by everyone around him turned into a man capable of horrors that would haunt California forever. When William Bonin was released from prison in 1978, the damage had already been done. His history of violent offenses and his prior imprisonment for sexual assault were clear signs of the danger he posed, but the system failed to protect the public. Bonin's release wasn't the result of rehabilitation, rather, it was due to systemic failures in the prison system that allowed violent offenders to re-enter society. Shortly after his release, the string of disappearances began. Young boys and teenage boys, most of them from troubled homes or living on the fringes of society, started vanishing in Southern California. Their stories were eerily similar. Many were last seen hitchhiking or walking alone, and most were never seen alive again. For months, their disappearances went unnoticed, and the media had no idea that a killer was on the loose. The victims were scattered across Los Angeles, Orange County, and the surrounding areas. As these disappearances continued, the bodies started to appear, discarded along freeway ramps and hillsides. The victims showed signs of extreme trauma. They were bound, often nude, and there were clear indications that they had been subjected to violent assault. The brutality of the crimes shocked the public, but what was even more terrifying was the lack of any clear motive. No ransoms were demanded. No personal grudges appeared to be involved. It was the work of a cold, methodical killer. The media, in a frenzy, began calling this mysterious killer the Freeway Killer, but the investigation was far from straightforward. Each crime seemed to follow a specific pattern: young male victims, taken from isolated locations, showing signs of restraint and sexual assault, and often dumped along major highways. Law enforcement initially struggled to connect the dots, as the victims came from different cities, and no one immediately suspected a serial killer. Some of the missing boys were even initially considered runaways, and the lack of coordination between local police departments hindered the investigation. What made Bonin's killings so disturbing was not just the method of murder but the frequency. Unlike many serial killers who space their crimes over weeks or months, Bonin's spree was relentless. He seemed to kill with alarming regularity, leaving little time for the public or authorities to recover from one tragedy before another occurred. His killings weren't just about satisfying a need for power over his victims, they were about something deeper, a compulsion he couldn't control. The investigation began to gain traction in early 1980, following the arrest of a young man named William Pugh, who had been involved in a minor crime unrelated to the murders. Under pressure from detectives, Pugh eventually cracked and described his interactions with Bonin, providing chilling details about Bonin's behavior. Pugh spoke about how Bonin would offer him rides, and how he would talk about his desires for young boys. At the time, Pugh didn't fully understand the extent of Bonin's criminal activities, but his statements provided investigators with their first real lead. The breakthrough came when police began to connect the pattern of abductions to a single vehicle, a van that Bonin often drove. The vehicle was plain, nothing special, and likely never drew attention in a crowded city. But inside that van was where the true horror unfolded. Victims were often held inside, restrained, sexually assaulted, and subjected to brutal treatment. The frequency and severity of the attacks made it clear that Bonin wasn't just a random offender. He was a predator who knew exactly how to lure and control his victims. Police began following Bonin, hoping to catch him in the act. In June 1980, they finally got their break. Bonin was spotted attempting to abduct a 15-year-old boy. The police moved in quickly, arresting him at the scene. What followed next was chilling. Bonin confessed to the crime he was caught committing, but he didn't stop there. He began recounting his crimes in a matter-of-fact way, almost as if he were reading a list of events. He talked about the murders, the victims, the accomplices, and the details of his operations. His calm demeanor and lack of remorse were terrifying, but it was the sheer number of victims he confessed to that would send shockwaves through the country. Bonin wasn't working alone. Over time, it became clear that he had manipulated other young men into assisting him in his crimes. These accomplices were often vulnerable themselves, either seeking approval or driven by their own troubled histories. In some cases, Bonin promised them money, in others, a sense of belonging or acceptance. They were drawn into his orbit, becoming pawns in his twisted game. Some of them, like Vernon Butts, were involved in the murders from the beginning. Others, like Gregory Miley and James Munro, were reluctant participants but ultimately became complicit due to Bonin's coercion and manipulation. The victims' families were left to grapple with the brutal truth of what had happened. They had watched their loved ones vanish into thin air, only to later learn the horrifying details of their deaths. For months, the families had hoped their sons were just missing, hoping for a return that would never come. Instead, they were left with a painful, brutal reality. The investigation began to uncover more and more victims, each one connected to Bonin through the same chilling pattern: young boys, bound, assaulted, and murdered. As the scale of Bonin's crimes became clearer, it forced law enforcement agencies to re-evaluate how they handled serial murder investigations. The lack of communication between different jurisdictions had allowed Bonin to continue his spree undetected. The Freeway Killer case became a lesson in the importance of collaboration between police forces, and it sparked changes in how serial murder investigations were managed across the country. William Bonin's arrest in 1980 was just the beginning of the legal battle that would follow. His trial became one of the most high-profile cases in California history, as the public finally began to see the full scope of his brutal crimes. But for the victims' families, the trial represented not just an opportunity for justice, but a long, painful process of confronting the evil that had taken so many lives. When the trial began in 1981, the prosecution faced an immense task. They had to present overwhelming evidence that not only linked Bonin to the crimes but also demonstrated the cold, calculated nature of his actions. The evidence was extensive and chilling. Bonin's confessions played a central role, but the prosecution was careful not to rely solely on his words. Forensic evidence tied Bonin to the crime scenes, with DNA, fingerprints, and fibers found on the victims matching Bonin's van and his personal belongings. The prosecution presented detailed accounts of how Bonin would abduct his victims, often luring them with promises of rides or other enticements. Once inside his van, the victims were subjected to horrific abuse, and many were killed in brutal, sadistic ways. The prosecution also called several survivors who had narrowly escaped Bonin's clutches. These testimonies were particularly impactful, as they gave the jury an understanding of Bonin's pattern and behavior. One of the most harrowing aspects of the trial was the testimony about Bonin's accomplices. It was revealed that Bonin had not acted alone in many of the murders. He had manipulated and coerced other young men into helping him abduct, abuse, and murder his victims. Some of the accomplices had been deeply traumatized by their involvement and came forward to testify against Bonin. Their testimonies were key in painting a picture of a man who preyed on the vulnerable, using manipulation and threats to bring others into his horrific crimes. The prosecution emphasized that Bonin was a serial killer with a clear pattern of behavior. His repeated crimes, lack of remorse, and the sheer number of victims all pointed to the fact that Bonin was not simply acting out of a momentary impulse. He was a cold, calculating predator who had been enabled by a system that failed to stop him after his initial offenses. In contrast, Bonin's defense team had a difficult task ahead of them. They knew they could not deny the overwhelming evidence against him, nor could they argue that he had not committed the murders. Instead, they focused on mitigating factors, attempting to paint Bonin as a product of his environment, someone who had been shaped by a traumatic and abusive childhood. Bonin's defense attorneys argued that his early years were filled with neglect, abuse, and emotional trauma. They claimed that Bonin had been a victim of both physical and sexual abuse throughout his childhood, and that these experiences had a profound effect on his psyche. They suggested that Bonin's actions were the result of these early experiences, and that he had been psychologically damaged by the trauma he endured. While this argument didn't absolve him of guilt, the defense hoped that it would lead to a lesser sentence. At one point, Bonin's attorneys called a psychological expert to testify that Bonin had suffered from severe mental illness. The expert suggested that Bonin was incapable of understanding the full consequences of his actions due to his mental state. This was an attempt to secure a more lenient sentence or even a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. However, this defense argument was not convincing to the jury. The prosecution had prepared a strong rebuttal, pointing out that Bonin had shown clear signs of planning and premeditation in his crimes. They also argued that his actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather a consistent pattern of calculated, predatory behavior. The trial was emotionally charged, as many family members of the victims took the stand to speak about the impact Bonin's actions had on their lives. The victims' families were devastated, and their statements were filled with grief, anger, and disbelief. These emotional testimonies were a powerful reminder of the real human toll of Bonin's crimes. One of the most poignant moments of the trial came when the mother of one of the victims spoke about the loss of her son. Her words were raw and heart-wrenching, and they left a lasting impression on the jury. She spoke of how her son had been a bright, hopeful young man with a promising future, and how his death had shattered her family. Her testimony highlighted the depth of the pain that Bonin had caused, and it helped the jury understand just how many lives had been ruined by his actions. The trial also featured the testimony of survivors, some of whom had managed to escape Bonin's grasp. Their stories were nothing short of miraculous, and they helped the jury understand just how dangerous Bonin had been. One survivor, who had been abducted by Bonin but managed to escape, spoke about his terrifying experience inside the van. His testimony provided crucial insight into Bonin's methods and gave the jury a glimpse into the true horror of his crimes. After several months of proceedings, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated for just over a week before reaching a verdict. William Bonin was found guilty of the murders of at least 10 young men and boys, though the prosecution believed the true number of victims was much higher. Bonin's defense had failed to convince the jury that he was mentally ill or incapable of understanding his actions. Instead, the jury found that he was fully responsible for his crimes. The jury's decision was met with a mixture of relief and anger. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of justice, but it didn't bring back their lost loved ones. Bonin was sentenced to death, though his execution would not occur until years later. The trial of William Bonin became a landmark case in the history of California's criminal justice system. It highlighted the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and the importance of addressing issues related to serial crime. Bonin's case also sparked debates about the death penalty and the psychological factors that contribute to criminal behavior. While the justice system had held him accountable, the broader societal issues surrounding his actions remained unresolved. Bonin's trial is remembered as a symbol of the horrors that serial killers can inflict, but it also serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, justice, and advocacy for the victims. It was a case that forever changed the way the public thought about serial crime, and it marked the beginning of a long, drawn-out legal journey for a man who would come to be known as the Freeway Killer.